Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into a place you probably only know from fantasy movies, the medieval forest. Forget what you think you know about chirping birds and quiet rustling. You're standing at the edge of a world that is, by modern standards, deafeningly loud, and yet filled with a kind of profound, unfamiliar quiet. You can hear the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a village you can't even see, the bleating of a faraway sheep, and the subtle groan of a cartwheel on a dirt track. It's a sonic landscape that would feel utterly alien to us now. The air doesn't just hold smells, but sounds, carrying them on the wind like whispers. You'll hear things you can't explain because you're a creature of asphalt and central air, and your ears have been trained to filter out the noise of nature. The reality is, if you were to walk into a true medieval forest, you'd likely get a headache within an hour from the sheer amount of sound and the strangeness of it all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you're doing that, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always cool to see where you're all drifting off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you'd notice about the medieval forest is the sound of its silence, or rather, the lack of it. We, in our modern world, have this idea that forests are hushed, tranquil places. We go there to escape the hum of our refrigerators and the distant drone of highway traffic. But a medieval person would have found our quiet to be eerie and unnatural. Their forests were alive with a constant hum of activity, an auditory tapestry woven from 1,000 sources. Think about it. A forest today is often just trees, the occasional bird, maybe a squirrel. A medieval forest was an economy, a highway, a pharmacy, and a pantry. You might hear the distant ring of an axe as a woodsman harvests timber for a new barn, or the sharp, high-pitched thwack of a stone striking a flint. These weren't just random noises. They were the heartbeat of the land, a constant reminder that the forest, though wild, was inextricably linked to human life. You'd hear the rustle of a peasant collecting firewood, their heavy, woolen tunic brushing against dried leaves on the forest floor, a sound far louder and more present than the synthetic whisper of a modern jacket, or the low, grunting call of a swineherd driving their pigs through the undergrowth to find acorns. One of the most profound differences, of course, was the total absence of mechanical sounds. No cars, no planes, no distant rumble of a freight train. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely alters the soundscape. Instead, you would be acutely aware of every single natural sound. The wind whistling through the branches of an ancient oak tree, a sound that today we might not even register, would have been a dominant feature, a constant presence that changed its pitch with the weather. The babbling of a brook, unburdened by the noise of a nearby highway, would be a low, melodic soundtrack to any journey. This lack of ambient, mechanical noise meant that the quiet moments were truly, profoundly quiet. A moment of stillness would feel less like an absence of sound and more like a gentle pause, a held breath in the forest's ongoing conversation. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more attuned to these subtle changes in sound, or if they simply took them for granted as the ever-present background to their lives. The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. They heard a world we can only imagine. Consider the quirky sounds of the forest, the little things that would catch your attention. You might hear the strange, repetitive thump 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 of a woodpecker, a sound so commonplace to us that we barely notice it, but to a medieval person, it might be a sign of a particular kind of insect infestation in a tree, or the sudden high-pitched whistle of a marmot, a creature that has largely disappeared from many parts of Europe, but was once a common part of the mountain forest ecosystem. And then there's the sound of the unseen, the creak of a tree branch, not from the wind, but from a bear cub climbing to find honey. The soft plop of a frog leaping into a puddle. These were not just noises, they were clues, a language you'd have to learn to understand. A true woodsman knew how to read the forest by its sounds, to discern the difference between a hungry wolf and a wandering dog, a falling branch and a feller's axe. It was a kind of oral literacy, and without it, you'd probably, to be perfectly honest, get lost and not survive long at all. You might even mistake the rustling of a harmless hedgehog for the approach of something far more menacing. And then there were the sounds of the human interaction with the forest itself. A group of pilgrims, their heavy boots making a soft squish in the damp earth, their low murmurs and quiet prayers echoing in the stillness. A child, perhaps, chasing a butterfly, their tiny feet a light patter, their delighted giggle a jarringly bright sound in the muted green world. It wasn't always a peaceful soundscape either. You'd have the sound of the king's huntsman, his horn a piercing, triumphant call that would carry for miles, signaling the kill of a stag. This was a sound of power, a declaration of dominion over the wild. All of these sounds, from the mundane to the majestic, would have been part of your everyday reality if you lived near a forest. They weren't just noises, they were the story of the day, a constant narrative told by the environment around you. We'll get into some of the more specific noises in a moment, but for now, just try to imagine that constant symphony, that never-ending conversation. As the sun climbs higher, the medieval forest doesn't just get brighter, it gets louder. You've woken up with the dawn chorus, that beautiful, chaotic symphony of birdsong that still exists today. But you're about to experience something far more profound. This is the daytime symphony, a chorus of sounds that tells you exactly who's home. The sound of a cuckoo, for instance, wasn't just a pretty song. It was a seasonal marker, a biological clock telling you spring had truly arrived. The sharp, incessant chattering of a red squirrel as it scampers up a tree, a sound that, in a modern forest, might be a brief distraction, was a constant, almost conversational presence in the undergrowth. You'd hear the rustle of a wild boar rooting for acorns, a sound that was both a promise of food and a warning to keep your distance. The lowing of cattle, if you were near a pasture, would carry on the breeze, a kind of bovine bass note to the whole affair. Every creature had a sound, and every sound had a meaning. One of the more quirky sounds you might hear is the low, repetitive buzzing of a swarm of wild bees. Beekeeping was a serious business in the Middle Ages, and finding a wild hive was like stumbling upon a small treasure. The sound of that swarm, that collective hum, would be a sign of sweet, precious honey, a rare treat in a world without refined sugar. Conversely, you might hear the sudden, terrified flapping of a bird taking flight as a predator. Perhaps a goshawk swoops down from above. This was a common sound, a flash of violence in the otherwise placid afternoon. Historians still debate whether medieval people had a richer, more nuanced auditory vocabulary for these sounds. Did they, for instance, have a different name for the sound of a startled deer versus a frightened hare. We can only guess, but it stands to reason that when your life depends on reading these subtle cues, your language would evolve to accommodate them. And it's not just the animals. There were the sounds of nature itself. The sharp, sudden crack of a falling branch, a sound that could make your heart leap. Or the gentle pitter-patter of a light rain shower beginning, a sound that would send a traveler scrambling for shelter. These sounds were not just background noise. They were a constant, low-level source of information and, sometimes, anxiety. A sudden shift in the wind's sound, from a gentle whisper to a mournful howl, could signal a change in the weather that was a matter of life or death. If you were lost or far from home, a mainstream historical fact is that the forest was a place of immense economic value. So its sounds were the sounds of labor and harvest. The rhythmic thud of a woodcutter's axe, the groan and subsequent crash of a falling tree, the distant, mournful cry of a shepherd calling to his flock. Of these were part of the daily grind. It wasn't a silent, untouched wilderness. It was a buzzing, working landscape. There was a certain, almost comedic element to some of these sounds. Imagine the huffing and puffing of a group of exhausted peasants trying to haul a felled log back to the village. Their grunts and groans, a kind of impromptu, off-key song. You'd hear the slap of a beaver's tail on the water, a sharp, surprising sound that would tell you you're in a place of industry and engineering. You'd probably also hear the gentle clink of a shepherd's staff against a rock, a sound that promised a simple, solitary life. The forest was full of these little auditory jokes and gentle reminders of its inhabitants. It's not just what you see, but what you hear that makes the forest feel alive. And in the medieval period, it was a very, very alive place. It's easy to romanticize this, of course, to imagine it all as a peaceful, sylvan dreamscape. The reality was a bit more intense. The sounds were louder, sharper, more immediate. There was no mute button, no headphones to tune it out. You were fully immersed in the soundscape, whether you liked it or not. The sound of a wolf's howl, for instance, wasn't a spooky effect in a movie. It was a genuine, terrifying sound that would have put you on high alert. This constant auditory input, this never-ending stream of information, would have been exhausting. But it was also, in its own way, deeply calming. Because every sound had a purpose. It told you where you were, who was with you, and what was happening. It was a kind of GPS for the soul, and if you knew how to listen, you'd never truly be lost. As you walk deeper, you start to hear the sounds of the human world bleeding into the forest. It's a subtle shift, a change in the background hum. The distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, for instance, isn't a simple sound. It's a promise of civilization, of tools, of a warm fire and a meal. You might hear the lowing of a herd of cattle being driven from a pasture into a nearby wood for foraging. Their plodding footfalls, a soft thud-thud on the damp earth. This sound tells you you're near a settlement, a place where humans are actively using the land for their sustenance. And then there are the people themselves. A child's delighted shriek as they spot a butterfly, a sound that would carry surprisingly far in the still air. The quiet murmur of a group of women gathering berries, their conversation a low, continuous buzz. These weren't just noises. They were markers on a map, a kind of auditory signpost telling you where you were in relation to the nearest village. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval villages were built on the edge of forests precisely for this reason. The forest was both a barrier and a resource. You needed to be close enough to it to gather food and wood, but far enough away to be safe from its wilder inhabitants. This proximity meant that the two soundscapes, the human and the wild, were constantly overlapping. You might hear the quiet thunk of a flail threshing grain in a nearby field, a sound that promised a harvest, a full belly, and a secure winter. And then, from the depths of the trees, you'd hear the call of a crow, a sound that could mean anything from the simple presence of a bird to a forewarning of a coming storm. The two worlds were always in conversation. Historians still argue whether medieval people considered the sounds of their own labor, the axe, the hammer, the saws, part of the natural soundscape, or if they saw them as a separate human intrusion. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The sound of a craftsman at work was likely as comforting and natural to them as the sound of a songbird. Consider the quieter, more intimate sounds of the village. The creak of a well's pulley, the quiet splish-splash of water being drawn from the ground, the soft pat-pat-pat of a laundress beating clothes on a rock by a stream. These sounds were part of the daily rhythm, a constant, gentle pulse that would have permeated the air. And these sounds were not always cheerful. You might hear the low, mournful bellow of a cow whose calf had been taken by a wolf, a sound of tragedy that would send a shiver down your spine, or the quiet sniffle of a child who had lost their way, a sound that would have prompted an entire village to search for them. A quirky tidbit is that people in the Middle Ages had a far more developed sense of sound directionality. The lack of ambient noise meant they could pinpoint the origin of a sound with incredible accuracy. They could tell if that crying child was to the north or to the west, if the cow was a half-mile away or a full mile. It was a skill you had to have, a kind of instinct born of necessity. This overlap of sounds was a constant reminder that the forest was not just a natural space, but a human one too. You'd hear the jingle of a bell on a pack horse, a sound that promised trade and news from the outside world, or the high-pitched squeal of a pig being driven to slaughter, a sound that was both a sad end and a promise of food for the winter. The forest, in its own way, was a part of the village. Its edge was not a hard line, but a soft, blurred transition, a place where the sounds of one world faded and the sounds of the other took over. And for a person living at that time, these sounds would have been like a map. You'd know where you were by the sounds you were hearing. A field of crickets would tell you you were near a meadow. The buzzing of a hive would tell you you were near a hollow tree. It was a kind of ancient auditory navigation system, and it was far more reliable than any map. So, as you drift off, just imagine that constant hum of life, that mix of human and nature. It's a soundscape that is both busy and, in its own way, profoundly peaceful. Because in that world, every sound had a purpose, and every purpose had a story. Now, we step deeper into the forest, into a world dominated by the hunt. This is not the quiet, solitary stalk you might imagine from modern documentaries. The medieval hunt was a loud, boisterous affair, a symphony of chaos and purpose. A mainstream historical fact is that the hunt was a deeply ritualized activity, often reserved for nobility, and its sounds were as much a part of the spectacle as the kill itself. You'd hear the baying of hounds, their collective bark a relentless, high-pitched frenzy as they chased down their quarry. These were not just any dogs. These were bred and trained specifically for their vociferousness, their loud calls designed to flush out the game and keep the hunters on track. The sound was a constant, moving tide of noise that would echo through the trees, a living pulse of the chase. And then there were the horns. The hunter's horn was not a simple instrument. It was a complex communication device. Each specific call had a meaning, a loud, clear signal that could be heard for miles. The long, mournful blast of the mort horn signaled the death of the stag, a sound of both triumph and finality. You might hear the sharp, quick blasts of the horn, a sound that would wake you from your slumber and tell you the hunt was beginning. This was a sonic language, a code that every hunter and servant knew, and it completely dominated the soundscape of the forest during a chase. Historians still argue about the exact number of horn calls and their meanings, but it's clear that this oral language was as important as any written word. It was a way for a widely dispersed group to coordinate and work as a single unit, their every action dictated by the blasts of a horn. Consider a more personal, visceral sound of the hunt, the panicked crashing of a fleeing deer. It's a sound of pure terror, a violent thrashing through the undergrowth, branches snapping and leaves scattering. This is not the gentle rustle you've heard before. This is a sound of raw survival. It's followed, of course, by the equally frantic sounds of the hounds, their paws pounding the earth, their barks getting louder and more frantic. A quirky tidbit is that people back then also listened for the sounds of different animals to gauge their mood. A wild boar, for instance, had a distinct snort and grunt that was different from its sound when it was cornered and enraged, a deep, guttural sound that was a clear warning to stay away. The sound of a bear huffing and snuffling was a sign of a foraging animal, but a loud roar was a sign of a dangerous, territorial beast. You had to learn this language of animal sounds to stay safe. The sounds of the hunt weren't just for the hunters either. The forest's other inhabitants, from the quietest mouse to the largest wolf, would have been acutely aware of this sonic intrusion. The chittering of a squirrel as it scolded the hounds from a safe distance, the sudden, hushed silence of all the small birds as the hunters passed these were the collateral sounds of the hunt, the echoes of its passing. You'd hear the shouted commands of the huntmaster, his voice a booming, authoritative presence that would have been a rare sound in the quiet forest. And as the hunt wore on, you'd hear the sounds of exhaustion, the heavy breathing of the hounds, the quiet, low murmuring of the tired horses, the soft thump-thump of a hound's wagging tail, as it finally caught up to its master. It was a very physical, very loud, very dramatic event, and the sounds it produced were completely different from any other sounds you'd find in the forest. It was a soundscape of primal instincts and human discipline, and it was the defining sound of the forest on a hunt day. As you picture it, imagine the sounds of the chase getting fainter and fainter as they disappear over the hill, leaving behind a sudden, shocking stillness. It's a quiet that feels earned, a kind of peaceful calm after the storm, and it would be the perfect moment to close your eyes and just breathe. As the sounds of the hunt fade, another set of sounds comes into focus, the gentle, rhythmic music of water. It's a sound that is both constant and ever-changing. You're standing by a small stream, a tributary that winds its way through the forest floor. The sound of its babbling is a kind of natural metronome, a soft, soothing presence. But it's not a uniform sound. You can hear the high, musical tinkle of water as it spills over small rocks, a sound that in the stillness of the forest can feel like a miniature waterfall. And then there's the deeper, more resonant gurgle as it flows around a submerged log, a sound that suggests a hidden world beneath the surface. This is a soundscape that modern life has largely muted with the rush of traffic and the distant hum of a city. For a medieval person, the sound of water would have been a profound source of information and comfort. It was a sign of life, of sustenance, and of a path through the wilderness. A mainstream historical fact is that streams and rivers were the highways of the medieval forest. They were not just sources of water. They were routes for travel, boundaries for territories, and sources of power for mills and forges. You might hear the low groan of a water wheel turning in the distance, a sound that tells you a mill is nearby and that grain is being ground. This sound would have been a symbol of life and industry, a gentle reminder that human ingenuity was at work even in the depths of the woods. A quirky tidbit is that people in the Middle Ages believed that certain streams had magical properties, and the sound of their water was a key part of that belief. The quiet, gentle lapping of water on the shore of a small pond might be seen as a place of rest for fairies, a place where you should tread lightly and speak softly. The rush of a fast-flowing river, on the other hand, was seen as a sign of power and could be a warning to be careful. Historians still argue whether medieval people consciously used the sounds of water for navigation, or if it was just a subconscious part of their wayfinding. It seems likely that they did. You could tell which way was downstream by the sound of the flow, and you could tell how far away a waterfall was by the loudness of its roar. The sounds of a river were a kind of auditory map, a constant guide through a landscape that was often featureless and confusing. And the sounds of water were not always so gentle. A sudden, violent downpour would turn a babbling brook into a roaring torrent, its sound a terrifying, deafening presence. The rain itself, a relentless drum on the leaves, would have been a sound of pure force, a reminder of nature's power. It's a sound that we, with our gutters and umbrellas, have largely forgotten the power of. The sounds of water were also the sounds of life. You'd hear the croaking of a frog on the bank, a sound that would announce the coming of a warm evening. The quiet, rhythmic plop of a fish jumping for a fly. The soft squish of your own feet as you walk through a marshy area near a stream. These were the sounds of a living, breathing ecosystem, a world that was teeming with life. And the sounds of water would have been a constant, gentle source of peace. After the loud chaos of the hunt or the demanding noise of a village, the sound of a small stream would have been a profoundly calming presence. It was a sound that reminded you that life goes on, that the world is a constant, flowing entity. It's a sound that has survived to this day, but in a world of endless noise, it's a sound that has lost its power to truly soothe. To a medieval person, it was a profound, beautiful symphony. As you stand by the stream, another layer of sound begins to reveal itself, a subtle tapestry woven into the background. These are the hidden sounds of the forest's smaller, quieter inhabitants. You've heard the roar of the bear and the baying of the hounds, but the forest is full of creatures you might never see, only hear. The soft, rhythmic snuffling of a foraging hedgehog, its tiny paws rustling through the leaf litter. The quiet, almost inaudible choo-choo of a beetle boring its way through a dead log. These are the sounds that a person in the medieval world would have had to learn to recognize as a matter of course. A quiet, almost non-existent sound could be the difference between finding a small meal or going hungry. A quirky and slightly unsettling tidbit is the sound of a mole tunneling just beneath your feet. A soft scrabble that would be completely swallowed up by modern ambient noise. This sound would have been a sign of a healthy, active forest floor. The forest floor was not static. It was a living, breathing, and most importantly, audible ecosystem. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval peasants and hunters were master trackers, and tracking was as much about listening as it was about seeing. The quiet snap of a twig under a deer's hoof, a sound that you might not even notice today, would have been a loud, clear signal to a hunter. The sudden, high-pitched chirp of a mouse from inside its burrow, a sign of a nearby owl, a silent predator that you would never see but could hear the effects of. Historians still argue about whether these people had a more developed sense of hearing, or if they simply lived in a world where sound was a more vital and necessary form of information. The answer, as always, is probably a mix of both. And then there are the less than pleasant sounds. The buzz of a biting fly, a sound that would announce its presence long before you felt its sting. The unsettling, quick rustle of a snake sliding through the undergrowth, a sound that would put you on high alert. These were the sounds of a dangerous world, a world where a quiet footfall could be a prelude to a bite or a sting. You can almost hear the soft, almost imperceptible plop of a frog leaping into a puddle, a sound that would be a welcome relief from the more menacing sounds. The forest was an orchestra of these tiny, subtle sounds, and you had to be a master conductor to understand it. You had to know the difference between the rustle of a harmless vole and the stealthy creep of a fox. These sounds were not just background noise. They were a constant, low-level narrative. You could hear the entire food chain in action if you listened closely enough. The quiet crunch, crunch, crunch of a rabbit chewing on a root, followed by the soft, almost silent thud of a hawk landing on a branch above. The entire drama of life and death was playing out in an oral loop all around you. The sounds were a constant reminder that you were a small part of a much larger, more complex system. And as you drift off, try to imagine that constant, subtle hum of life, that quiet buzz of activity, that gentle rustle of creatures going about their business. It's a soundscape that we've lost, a kind of peaceful background noise that reminds us of the interconnectedness of all things. It's the sound of a world that is whole and complete in itself, and it's a sound that is profoundly, deeply soothing. You're still in the depths of the forest, but now you're listening for the wind, not just feeling it on your skin, but hearing its voice as it moves through the canopy. The sound of the wind was a profound thing to a medieval person. It wasn't just a force of nature. It was a character, a presence, a kind of invisible messenger. You would hear the wind as a gentle, continuous sigh as it brushed through the leaves of a beech tree, a sound that was soft and almost musical. But then it would pick up, and you'd hear a low, mournful moan as it whistled through the high branches of a towering oak, a sound that might have been interpreted as a sad spirit wandering the woods. This sound was a constant presence, a kind of breathing of the forest itself, a reminder that something powerful and unseen was always there. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval people were incredibly skilled at reading the wind for weather patterns. The sound of a sudden, sharp gust of wind coming from the north, for instance, could be a warning of an impending cold front or a coming storm, a sound that would send a shepherd scrambling to find shelter for his flock. The gentle, consistent rustle of a warm breeze from the south would be a sound of comfort, a sign of pleasant weather, and a good day for travel or work. This auditory weather forecasting was a vital skill, one that we have largely lost in our world of instant weather apps. A quirky tidbit is that in some folk traditions, the sound of the wind was seen as the voice of the gods or of spirits. A particularly eerie whistle might be a fairy leading a traveler astray, a kind of ghostly siren song. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were deeply held spiritual convictions or simply a way to explain natural phenomena in a world without scientific understanding. And the sound of the wind was not just about the weather. It was about the forest itself. You could hear the difference between the whispering of a pine forest and the rustling of a deciduous one. The sound of the wind in a field of tall grass was different from its sound as it passed over a rocky outcrop. Every part of the landscape had its own unique sound, a kind of acoustic signature, and you would learn to recognize them. The gentle swish-swish of the leaves in a grove of birch trees might be a sign of a clearing ahead, a place where the wind had room to move freely. The sudden, muffled silence as you enter a dense part of the forest, a place where the trees block the wind, would be a sign that you were truly deep in the woods, a quiet that would feel both peaceful and a little unnerving. The sound of the wind was a constant source of both comfort and alarm. It could be a gentle lullaby, a soft, continuous hum that would lull you to sleep in a sheltered camp. Or it could be a howling, shrieking tempest, a sound of pure power that would make you fear for your life. And it was always there, a continuous presence that was a constant reminder of the wildness and untamable nature of the world. As you imagine this, just try to feel the air on your face and listen for its sound. That soft whisper through the leaves, that low groan from the branches. It's a sound that connects you to every person who has ever walked through a forest, from the earliest human to the last one. The wind picks up and the forest begins to groan. You've heard the gentle whisper, but now you're experiencing the full-throated roar of a medieval thunderstorm. A mainstream historical fact is that without modern weather forecasting, a storm was a sudden, violent intrusion, a terrifying force of nature. The first sound you'd hear is the low, deep rumble of thunder in the distance, a sound that would build slowly, a kind of acoustic warning. Then you'd hear the frantic worry and fluttering of birds, their wings a sudden, chaotic sound as they scrambled for cover. And as the storm approached, the wind would shriek through the trees, a high-pitched howl that would feel less like a natural force and more like a living, angry entity. This was not the gentle wind of before. This was a sound of pure power and danger. Then, of course, comes the rain. It's not just a soft pitter-patter. It's a torrential downpour, a relentless, deafening drum on the leaves above you. Every leaf, every branch, every patch of moss becomes a tiny drum, and the collective sound is overwhelming. The ground, a moment ago a soft carpet of leaves, becomes a squelching, muddy mess, and you'd hear the squish of your own feet as you tried to find shelter. The sound of a lightning strike, a sudden, blinding crack that would split the air, would be a shocking punctuation mark in the relentless symphony of the storm. Historians still argue about whether people in the Middle Ages had a deeper, more primal fear of these storms, or if they simply accepted them as part of the natural order. It's likely that it was both. A storm was a sound of God's wrath, a kind of divine punishment, but it was also just a Tuesday. A quirky tidbit is that the sound of the rain was used to predict how long the storm would last. A soft, steady rain might signal a long, continuous shower, a sound that could go on for hours. A sudden, violent downpour with loud thunder might be a sign of a fast-moving storm that would pass quickly, a sound of quick, explosive energy. The sound of the wind was also important. The direction from which the wind came during the storm would tell you where it was heading, a kind of natural compass that you'd learn to read from a young age. And then there's the sound of the water. Small streams would turn into roaring torrents, their sound a deep, resonant rumble as they carried away debris. You'd hear the plop-plop-plop of water dripping from the leaves long after the rain had stopped, a sound of a slow return to normalcy. A storm in a medieval forest was a complete assault on the senses. The air would be heavy with the smell of wet earth and ozone, and the ground would be a treacherous, slippery mess. And the soundscape would be completely dominated by the storm itself. The low groan of a tree swaying in the wind, the crack of a branch giving way, the relentless roar of the wind and rain. All other sounds, the birds, the animals, the people, would be completely muted, their small voices swallowed up by the immense, chaotic power of the storm. And as the storm finally passed, you would be left with a deep, profound silence. Not a quiet, but a silence. A place where the noise had just been so overwhelming that the absence of it was a sound in and of itself. It's a silence that would feel like a weight, a heavy blanket of peace after a period of intense chaos. As the storm recedes, the forest transforms into a place of new and eerie sounds. The day has given way to night, and with the darkness comes a complete shift in the auditory landscape. The daytime symphony of birds and insects is replaced by a more subtle and at times unsettling chorus. You might hear the quiet, continuous hissing of a nocturnal snake sliding through the leaves, a sound that in the daytime would be easily lost, but in the stillness of the night feels both close and menacing. The soft hoot of an owl, a sound that we find comforting today, would have been a sound of a silent predator, a reminder that the hunt continued even in the dark. A mainstream historical fact is that without artificial light, people's senses, particularly their hearing, would have been far more acute at night. The sound of a footfall in the dark, a twig snapping, a quiet rustle in the bush saw of these would have been heard and interpreted with a level of detail that we can't imagine. The night was a canvas of shadows and sounds, a place where a person's imagination could run wild. A quirky tidbit is that in many medieval traditions, the sounds of the night were seen as communications from the spirit world. The long, drawn-out cry of a fox in the distance might be seen as a lost soul, a sound of profound sadness. The sudden, high-pitched shriek of a barn owl could be seen as a sign of an impending death in a nearby village. These sounds were not just noises. They were stories, omens, and warnings, a constant source of both fear and fascination. Historians still argue about whether these superstitions were a form of religious belief or a kind of practical survival tool, a way of giving meaning to a world that was often terrifying and incomprehensible. It's likely that they were both. The sounds of the night were a kind of narrative, a low, continuous hum of the world's secrets, and it was a soundscape that was deeply, profoundly quiet. Without the hum of modern life, the silence of a medieval forest at night would have been a deafening presence. You would hear the sound of your own heart beating, the soft rustle of your clothes as you moved, the sound of your own breathing. This kind of silence is something we have completely lost, and it would have been a powerful, almost overwhelming thing to experience. You might also hear the low, continuous thrumming of an insect, a sound that would fill the air with a kind of pulsing energy, or the sudden, high-pitched yelp of a small animal that had been caught by a predator, a sound of quick, brutal violence that would be a shocking punctuation mark in the quiet. And then there are the sounds of the night's other inhabitants, the quiet scrabble of a mouse, the soft patter of a badger, the rustle of a wild cat. These were the sounds of a world that came alive after the sun went down, a world of shadows and secrets, a world that was far more active and noisy than we might imagine. But even in that noise, there was a kind of peacefulness, because it was an ancient sound, a sound that had existed for thousands of years, and it was a sound that connected you to every person who had ever walked through that forest in the dark. The night has deepened, and now you're hearing the sounds of human travel in the dark. It's a very different sound from the village noises or the hunt. This is the sound of a lone traveler, a merchant, or a pilgrim, making their way down a forest path. The main sound, of course, is the soft, rhythmic thud-thud of their own footsteps, but it's not a uniform sound. You can hear the subtle change as they step from a patch of hard-packed dirt to a soft bed of moss, the sound muting to a quiet squish, or the sharp crunch as their boot lands on a pile of dried leaves. A sound that in the daytime would be unnoticeable, but in the stillness of the night is jarringly loud. Every step is a deliberate, cautious act, and the sounds it makes are a constant, low-level reminder of your own presence in the vastness of the woods. A mainstream historical fact is that long-distance travel in the Middle Ages was incredibly dangerous and difficult, and much of it had to be done on foot. This meant that travelers would have been keenly aware of their own sounds and the sounds of those around them. You might hear the quiet creak of a leather satchel as the person shifts its weight on their shoulder, a sound that in a modern world would be completely lost. The soft jingle of a coin in a purse, a sound that would be a terrifying thing to hear in the dead of night, a clear signal of potential wealth to anyone lurking in the shadows. Historians still argue about whether people traveling at night were more likely to talk or remain silent. It's a tricky question. A quiet word might comfort a companion, but a loud conversation could draw unwanted attention. The sounds of a medieval traveler, then, were a kind of calculated risk, a balance between comfort and safety. A quirky tidbit is that people back then had a specific term for the sounds of a horse's gait at night. The quiet, rhythmic clop-clop of a horse's hooves on a path was a comforting sound, a sign of steady progress. But the sudden, irregular clip-clop and then silence would be a sign of a horse shying at something unseen, a clear warning that there was danger ahead. The sound of a horse's whinny was also a sign of its mood, a soft nicker for comfort, or a high-pitched snort for alarm. You had to learn to read these sounds as a matter of course. And it wasn't just the large animals. You might hear the quiet, frantic pitter-patter of a mouse or a shrew, their tiny footsteps a sudden, surprising presence in the dark. The sounds of the traveler, then, were a constant, quiet dialogue with the world around them. The gentle swish of a cloak in the wind, the low murmur of a prayer, the quiet click of a flint and steel as they tried to light a small lantern. These were all sounds that told a story of a person alone in the wilderness, relying on their senses to guide them. And in a world without streetlights or smartphones, these sounds were their only guide. They were a kind of ancient, auditory GPS, and if you knew how to listen, you'd never truly be lost. It's a kind of peace that comes from being completely immersed in the natural world, a kind of calm that we have completely lost. You've made it through the night, and now you're hearing the sounds of a temporary community forest camp. This is a very different soundscape than the lone traveler. The primary sound is the crackle and hiss of a fire, a sound that in the stillness of the woods is a powerful and comforting presence. It's not just a steady sound, it's a living thing, with tiny pops and spits as bits of sap and water burn off, and a low, continuous rumble as the wood itself is consumed. Around that fire, you'd hear the quiet murmur of voices, a low, continuous buzz of conversation that would be a profound source of reassurance in the depths of the wild. A mainstream historical fact is that campfires were not just for warmth and cooking. They were a central point for storytelling and community. You would hear the soft, rhythmic thud of a piece of wood being placed on the fire, a sound that would punctuate the conversation. You'd also hear the clink of metal against a rock as someone sharpened a knife, a quiet, almost musical sound that spoke of purpose and preparation. Historians still argue whether the sounds of a forest camp were more or less peaceful than the sounds of a village. A village had the constant noise of labor and animals. A camp, while still active, had a more focused, contained soundscape centered around the fire and the people. A quirky tidbit is the sound of a leather water skin being unstoppered, a quiet pop that would be a sound of life and refreshment, and the sound of water being poured from it, a soft, continuous glug glug glug. These are sounds that have largely disappeared from our world, replaced by the crinkle of a plastic bottle. The sounds of a camp were intimate and immediate. You'd hear the quiet clink of a spoon, the soft slurp of someone drinking hot broth, the low growl of a dog as it settled by the fire. It was a soundscape of survival and companionship, a kind of acoustic bubble in the middle of a vast and wild world. And then there are the sounds that a camp would make that were not so gentle. The sudden squeal of a rabbit being cleaned for dinner, a sound that would be a quick, brutal reminder of the realities of life in the wild. The soft click-clack of a dice game, a sound of idle distraction in the midst of a journey. All of these sounds, from the mundane to the violent, would have been part of the acoustic world of a forest camp. As you imagine it, just picture that gentle glow of the fire, the warmth on your face, and the low, continuous sounds of life all around you. It's a sound that promises safety and community, a sound that would lull you to sleep with a profound sense of peace. The camp is silent now, but the forest is not. You're hearing the sounds of those who live outside the law, the outlaws. This is a soundscape of stealth and quiet purpose. The primary sound is the absence of sound, the deliberate muting of every footstep, the soft, almost inaudible swish of a cloak being held close, the quiet thud of a leather boot landing on a patch of soft moss instead of a dry twig. An outlaw's life depended on not being heard, so their sounds were a kind of anti-symphony, a deliberate counterpoint to the more boisterous sounds of the rest of the world. A mainstream historical fact is that outlaws were not always the romantic figures of legend. They were often people who were simply trying to survive after being cast out of their village. Their sounds, then, were the sounds of that struggle. You might hear the quiet plink of an arrow being placed on a bowstring, a sound of preparation. The soft thump of a small, carefully thrown rock, a sound used to create a diversion. And then there's the sound of their own breathing, a quiet, continuous presence in the stillness of the night. Historians still argue whether the quiet of an outlaw's life was more or less stressful than the noisy life of a peasant. A peasant had to deal with the constant noise of the village, but an outlaw had to deal with the constant silence of a world where every sound could be a sign of danger. A quirky tidbit is that outlaws often used the sounds of the forest to their advantage. They might mimic the call of a fox or the hoot of an owl to communicate with each other, a kind of secret language of the wild. The sound of a bird's call could mean all clear, while a sudden, sharp cry could mean danger. These were sounds that would be completely incomprehensible to an outsider, but to those who lived in the shadows, they were a matter of life and death. The forest itself was their accomplice, its natural noises providing a cover for their movements. You'd hear the rustle of the wind in the leaves, the babbling of a brook, the distant cry of a deer. All of these sounds would have provided a perfect cover for their movements. And then there are the sounds of an outlaw's camp, which would be completely different from the firelit camp we just heard. It would be a quiet, hushed place. No fire, no loud conversation. The sounds would be limited to the essentials: the soft snap of a small ration of food being broken, the gentle slurp of water being drunk from a stream. It was a world of quiet survival, a world where every sound, no matter how small, had a purpose and a meaning. It's a soundscape that is both peaceful and deeply unsettling. A world where the quiet is both a comfort and a constant reminder of the danger that lurks just beyond the edges of the light. The outlaw's quiet has faded, and now you're hearing a more gentle, yet equally specific sound: the shepherd's forest. This soundscape is defined by one primary noise: the quiet, continuous jingle-jangle of a sheep's bell. This is not the loud, frantic sound of a village bell. This is a low, persistent hum, a kind of auditory tracking device that would tell a shepherd exactly where their flock was. A mainstream historical fact is that shepherding was a solitary and demanding profession, and the bells were a vital tool for keeping track of a widely dispersed flock. You would hear the subtle change in the sound as a sheep moved from an open field to a dense part of the forest, the sound becoming more muffled and muted. This was a kind of ancient radar system, and it was a sound of constant reassurance. Historians still argue about whether the sound of these bells was a comfort to the shepherd or a source of low-level anxiety, a constant reminder of their responsibility. It was probably both. The bell was a sign that the sheep were still there, but it was also a sign that they were still in the wilderness, still vulnerable. A quirky tidbit is that different regions had different styles of bells, and a shepherd could tell, just by the sound, which flock was which. A large, deep-toned bell might belong to a ram, while a small, high-pitched bell might belong to a lamb. These bells were a kind of auditory signature, a unique sound that told a story about the flock and the land it inhabited. And the soundscape of the shepherd's forest was not just the bells. You would also hear the quiet, continuous bleat, bleat, bleat of the sheep themselves, a soft, almost plaintive sound. The low murmur of a shepherd's voice, a quiet, reassuring presence that would keep the flock calm. The soft thump of a shepherd's staff against a rock, a kind of punctuation mark in the quiet. It was a soundscape of peace and purpose, a quiet, continuous hum of life and work. It's a sound that has largely disappeared from our modern world, replaced by the hum of machinery and the rush of traffic. But for a medieval person, the sound of a shepherd's bells would have been a profound source of peace. a sound that told them that all was well in the world, that life was going on, and that the flock was safe. The quiet of the shepherd's forest is a short-lived peace. Now you're hearing the sounds of a different kind of inhabitant, a person who has made the deep woods their permanent home. This is the sound of the forest dweller, someone who lives completely off the land. Their soundscape is defined by a low, continuous hum of self-sufficiency. You might hear the quiet thunk of an axe on a sapling, a sound that is not a chaotic force, but a purposeful, rhythmic motion. The soft swish of a basket being woven from reeds, a sound of patient, deliberate craft. These are not the loud, boisterous sounds of the village. These are the sounds of a person in constant, quiet conversation with the land itself. A quirky tidbit is that these forest dwellers, often hermits or recluses, had a remarkable auditory vocabulary for the sounds of the forest. They could tell the difference between the sound of a hungry fox and a full one, a sound of stealth versus a sound of contentment. They could hear the subtle change in the sound of a stream as the water level rose, a sound that would warn them of an impending flood. These sounds were their constant companions, their only source of information about the world outside their small patch of wilderness. A mainstream historical fact is that these individuals, while rare, were a known part of the medieval landscape. They were often seen as wise, strange, or even magical, and the sounds of their quiet lives would have been a source of both mystery and fascination to those who lived in the more populated parts of the world. Historians still argue about whether these forest dwellers were truly isolated or if they had a quiet, unspoken relationship with the nearest village, trading knowledge of the woods for tools or food. It's likely that it was a combination of both. The sound of a bird's call could have been a signal, a kind of secret language for a quick trade. The sound of a human cough in the distance, a sign that the village was approaching, a sound that would send a recluse scurrying into the shadows. The sounds of their lives were a kind of low, continuous whisper, a sound that would be completely lost to us today. And then there are the sounds of their daily routine, the quiet snap of a small ration of dried meat being broken, the soft plop of a small fish being caught in a net, the gentle tinkle of water being caught in a wooden bowl. These were the sounds of a life lived in perfect sync with the rhythms of the forest. It's a soundscape that is both peaceful and deeply humbling, a world where the quiet is not an absence of sound, but a profound, deep presence. The forest dwellers' quiet has faded, and now you're hearing the sounds of purpose and management. This is the sound of the forester, the person whose job it was to maintain and protect the king's woods. The soundscape here is one of control and order. You'll hear the quiet thwack of a hatchet against a small branch, not to fell a tree, but to mark it for future harvest. This sound was a kind of auditory signature of the forester, a continuous presence that told you the forest was being watched and managed. It's a sound that we don't have a modern equivalent for, a sound of gentle, deliberate human interaction with the wilderness. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval forest was a highly regulated and valuable resource, and the forester was its guardian. They would have been keenly attuned to the sounds of its health. The low, continuous buzzing of a hive of bees, for instance, would be a sign of a healthy, productive forest. The sound of a beetle boring its way through a tree, on the other hand, would be a sign of disease or infestation, a sound that would alert the forester to a potential problem. Historians still argue whether the forester's job was more about conservation or about resource management. It's likely that it was a combination of both. The forester had to ensure the long-term health of the forest, but they also had to ensure that it was producing enough timber and game to satisfy the king. A quirky tidbit is the sound of the forester's dog, a quiet, well-trained hound that would be a constant companion. The dog's soft, almost inaudible whine or the gentle tap of its tail on the ground would be a sign of its presence and its awareness of the surrounding world. This was not the loud, boisterous sound of a hunting dog. This was a sound of quiet companionship and purpose. And then there are the sounds of the forester's tools, the soft ping of a metal file against an axe head, a sound of maintenance and care, the gentle whoosh of a heavy rake as it cleared a path, a sound of deliberate, careful labor. All of these sounds were part of the acoustic world of the forester, a world of quiet, continuous work. And then there are the sounds that a forester would be listening for. The quiet snap of a twig, a sound that could mean a poacher was nearby. The low, continuous murmur of a small stream, a sound that would tell them a path was nearby. The forester was a master of the forest's soundscape, a kind of acoustic cartographer who could tell where they were just by listening to the sounds around them. It's a sound that is both peaceful and deeply purposeful, a sound that promises a world that is cared for and protected. The forester's ordered sounds have faded, and now you're hearing something more unsettling, the sounds of superstition. For a person in the Middle Ages, the forest was not just a natural place. It was a place of spirits, of fairies, and of ghosts. The sounds they heard were often interpreted through this magical lens. You might hear the quiet, continuous thrumming of a wild bee's nest, a sound that in one tradition might be a sign of a healthy, productive forest, and in another might be a sign of a fairy dwelling, a place where you should never, ever disturb the quiet. The sudden, high-pitched shriek of an owl, a sound we might find charming today, was often interpreted as a harbinger of death, a kind of ghostly warning. These sounds were not just noises, they were stories and omens, a constant source of both fear and fascination. A quirky tidbit is the sound of the wind. We've talked about it as a weather indicator, but in the realm of superstition, a particularly eerie whistle was often believed to be the voice of a mischievous fairy, leading a traveler astray. The sound of a sudden gust of wind, a sound we might attribute to a sudden pressure change, was often seen as the passing of a ghost or a spirit, a sound of an unseen presence. Historians still argue about whether these superstitions were a form of religious belief or a kind of practical survival tool. It's likely that they were both. A person might believe that a sound was a ghost, but they would also know that a sudden loud sound in the night was a sign of danger, and they would act accordingly. The superstition provided a framework for understanding the danger, and the understanding provided a way to survive it. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the sounds of the medieval forest were a source of fear precisely because of these beliefs. The quiet, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of a beaver building a dam might be a sign of a good, solid animal, but it could also be a sound of a magical creature, a kind of forest imp. The sound of a frog's croak, a sound that we find benign, was often a sign of a curse or a spell, a sound that would send a person scrambling to get away. The sounds were a kind of low, continuous whisper from the supernatural world, a world that was always just on the edge of the visible. And then there are the sounds that were actively created to ward off these spirits. the quiet jingle-jangle of a small bell on a traveler's bag, a sound that was believed to keep evil spirits away, the soft, continuous murmur of a prayer, a sound of faith in a world that was filled with unseen dangers. All of these sounds, from the natural to the supernatural, were part of the auditory world of a person in the Middle Ages. They were a constant reminder that the world was a strange and magical place, and that every sound had a story to tell. The superstitious sounds have faded, and now you're hearing something far more tangible and powerful. The sound of a woodsman at work. This is a sound of raw labor and deliberate action. The primary sound, of course, is the rhythmic thud-thud of an axe hitting wood. But it's not a single, continuous sound. It's a symphony of controlled force. You can hear the initial whoosh of the axe through the air, followed by the sharp, resounding crack as it bites into the wood. The sound of the wood itself changes as the cut gets deeper, a kind of groan and protest as the fibers are severed. A mainstream historical fact is that wood was the primary fuel source and building material of the Middle Ages. So the sound of the woodsman's axe would have been a constant, pervasive presence on the outskirts of any settlement. It was the sound of life, of warmth, and of progress. A quirky tidbit is that woodsmen had a whole series of sounds for their tools. The soft ping of a metal wedge being hammered into a log, a sound of precise force. The soft hiss of a two-man saw, a sound of teamwork and slow, deliberate progress. These sounds were not just for the woodsman, they were also for the forest itself. The trees would groan and creak, a kind of lament as they were brought down. The sound of a bird taking flight in a sudden, frantic flapping of wings would be a sign that the woodsman was nearby. Historians still argue about whether the woodsman's work was seen as a peaceful, rhythmic labor or a brutal, violent act against nature. It was likely a combination of both. The sound of the axe was a sound of order and purpose, but it was also a sound of destruction. And then there's the sound of the tree's final moment, the slow, protesting creak, creak, creak as it begins to lean, followed by a sudden, deafening crash as it hits the ground, a sound that would echo through the forest for miles. This was a sound of finality, of a life ended for a human purpose. After the crash, you'd be left with a sudden, jarring silence. A silence that was both a relief and a kind of mourning. The woodsman's work was a constant reminder of the human presence in the forest, a sound that was both a promise of warmth and a symbol of nature's subjugation. The woodsman's crash has faded, and now you're hearing something far more chaotic and terrifying. The sounds of a medieval battlefield in the forest. This is not the grand open field conflict you might imagine from movies. This is a claustrophobic, brutal symphony of violence. The sounds are sharp, immediate, and deafening. You'll hear the continuous thwack-thwack-thwack of swords hitting shields, a relentless, percussive rhythm that would feel like a physical assault. The low, continuous groan of men in pain. A sound that is both a sign of suffering and a kind of terrible bass note to the chaos. This is not the quiet of the woods. This is the noise of human desperation and violence. A mainstream historical fact is that battles fought in forests were often more disorganized and brutal than those fought in open fields. The trees themselves became obstacles, and the sounds were confusing and disorienting. You'd hear the sharp snap of a branch being broken as a panicked soldier ran through the undergrowth, the soft thud of a body falling to the ground, the desperate clank of armor as a man struggled to get up. Historians still argue about whether the acoustics of a forest made these battles more or less terrifying. The sounds would have been muffled and distorted by the trees, but they also would have been inescapable, a kind of acoustic cage from which there was no escape. A quirky tidbit is the sound of the archers. You'd hear the quiet thrum of a bowstring, a sound that would be a silent, deadly prelude to a volley of arrows. The soft hiss of the arrows as they flew through the air, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. And then there's the sound of the arrows hitting their targets, a sharp thud as they pierced wood or flesh, a sound of quick, brutal finality. The sounds of a battle in the forest were a constant, chaotic narrative, a story of life and death told in 1,000 tiny moments of sound. And as you imagine it, just picture that deafening chaos, the cries of men, the clash of steel, the rustle of leaves. It's a soundscape that is the opposite of peaceful, but in its own way. It's a sound that tells a story about the raw, unfiltered violence of the past. It's a reminder that the medieval forest, while often beautiful, was also a place of immense danger and conflict. The echo of battle has been replaced by a more primal, animal sound. You're hearing the sounds of a wild boar. This is a soundscape of raw power and territoriality. The primary sound is a low, continuous snuffling and grunting as the boar roots through the undergrowth for food. It's a sound of purpose, of a relentless search for sustenance, but it can quickly change. If the boar is startled, you'll hear a sudden, high-pitched squeal, a sound of panic and alarm that would send a shiver down your spine. And if it's enraged, you'll hear a deep, guttural snort and a sharp, continuous hiss as it lowers its head and prepares to charge. A quirky tidbit is that people in the Middle Ages could tell the age and size of a boar just by the sounds it made. A young boar would have a higher-pitched squeal, while a large, old boar would have a deeper, more resonant grunt. The sounds were a kind of acoustic identifier, a way of knowing what you were dealing with before you ever saw it. A mainstream historical fact is that wild boars were a serious danger to people and livestock, and the sound of one nearby was a sign to be cautious. The sound of a boar's tusks scraping against a tree trunk, a sound of sharpening and aggression, was a clear warning to give it a wide berth. Historians still argue about whether the sound of a wild boar was more terrifying than the sound of a wolf. The wolf's howl was a sound of a silent, stealthy predator, while the boar's sound was a direct, confrontational roar. The answer, as always, is probably a matter of personal preference. And then there are the collateral sounds of the boar's presence. The rustle of a large animal moving through the undergrowth, a sound that would be impossible to mistake for a smaller animal. The crunch of a branch under its weight, the soft squish of its feet in the mud. All of these were sounds that told a story about the presence of a powerful and dangerous animal. It's a soundscape of raw, untamed nature, a sound that is both a reminder of the wildness of the world and a sign of its power. The sounds of the wild boar have faded, and now you're experiencing a different kind of quiet, the muffled, hushed sounds of a medieval forest on a winter day. This soundscape is defined by the absence of the bustling life of summer. The loud, vibrant chorus of birds is gone, replaced by the occasional, stark call of a raven or a crow. A sound that in the stillness of the cold air feels both sharp and poignant. The rustle of leaves is gone, replaced by the soft crunch of your boots on frozen snow, or the gentle thud of a snow-laden branch as it finally gives way under its weight. This is a soundscape of stillness and preservation, a world that has gone to sleep. A mainstream historical fact is that winter was a time of survival, and the sounds of it were a constant reminder of the cold and the scarcity of food. You'd hear the quiet plink 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 of an icicle dripping from a branch, a sound that, while small, would be a constant presence in the stillness. The creak of a frozen branch in the wind, a sound that in the daytime would be unnoticeable, but in the quiet of a winter day would sound like a living thing groaning in protest. Historians still argue about whether people in the Middle Ages saw winter as a peaceful, quiet time or as a terrifying, dangerous one. The answer, of course, is both. The quiet of the winter was a kind of peace, a time for rest, but it was also a time of constant vigilance and struggle. A quirky tidbit is the sound of the snow itself. It has its own unique sounds, a quiet, almost silent whoosh as it falls from the branches of a tree, or a soft, muffled swish as you brush it from your cloak. These were sounds that were unique to this season, sounds that told a story about the world being covered in a blanket of silence. The sound of the wind, too, was different. It would whistle through the bare branches, a high-pitched, lonely sound that would be a constant presence. And then there are the sounds of the animals that are still active, the quiet thump of a rabbit as it burrows into a snowdrift, the soft patter of a fox as it hunts, its paws making almost no sound on the soft snow. These were the sounds of a world that was still alive, still active, but in a very different way. The winter days' sounds have faded, and now you're experiencing something far more chilling, a medieval forest on a winter night. This is a soundscape of stark, unyielding quiet, punctuated by sounds that feel both alien and terrifying. The primary sound is the crisp, continuous crackle of a fire, a sound that in the cold air feels both a comfort and a sharp, sudden presence. But beyond the fire, the world is a place of profound, almost total silence. The snow on the ground acts as a natural muffler, swallowing up all but the most immediate sounds. You'd hear the soft, almost inaudible creak of a tree branch as it groans under the weight of the ice, the quiet hiss of a snowflake as it hits a hot coal. This is a soundscape of minimalism, a world of black and white, and sounds that feel both beautiful and unsettling. A mainstream historical fact is that a winter night was the most dangerous time for a traveler. The quiet made them vulnerable, and the cold made them desperate. You'd hear the soft, almost inaudible crunch of an animal's paw on the snow, a sound that could mean a quiet predator was on the prowl. The distant, mournful howl of a wolf, a sound that in the cold, still air would carry for miles, a sound of both wildness and profound loneliness. Historians still argue about whether the quiet of a winter night was more terrifying than the noise of a summer day. The noise, at least, was a sign of life. The quiet was often a sign of death. A quirky tidbit is the sound of the ice itself. It had its own soundscape, a kind of internal music. You'd hear the soft tinkle of an icicle as it broke off from a branch and fell to the ground, the low, resonant groan of a frozen river as the ice shifted and settled. These were sounds that were unique to this time of year, sounds that told a story about a world that was in suspended animation. The sound of your own breathing, a small, continuous huff of air, would be a constant presence, a reminder that you were a living thing in a world that felt like it had gone to sleep. It's a sound that is both peaceful and deeply unsettling. A world where the quiet is not an absence of sound, but a profound, deep presence. the winter night's sounds have given way to a new acoustic world. You're hearing the sounds of the forest at dawn, the slow, gradual return of the world after a long period of darkness and quiet. The first sound you'd hear would be a low, almost imperceptible chirp from a lone bird, a kind of acoustic scout announcing the coming of the light. This sound would be followed by others, a kind of hesitant chorus of life. The quiet rustle of a squirrel as it emerges from its nest, the soft patter of a rabbit as it ventures out for an early morning meal. This is a soundscape of hope and renewal, a world waking up from its slumber. A quirky tidbit is the sound of the dew. You'd hear the quiet plink of a dewdrop falling from a leaf, a sound that in the quiet of the morning would feel like a tiny musical note. This was a sound that told a story about the temperature and the coming of the sun. The sound of a leaf unfurling, a soft crackle that you would never hear in the noise of a modern forest, would be a sign of a new day, a new beginning. Historians still argue about whether people in the Middle Ages saw the dawn chorus as a simple natural event or as a religious sign, a kind of daily miracle. It was likely a combination of both. The sound of the birds was a promise of a new day, a new chance to live. A mainstream historical fact is that the dawn was a time of intense activity for both humans and animals. You'd hear the quiet thud of a peasant's footsteps as they headed out to the fields, their journey a soft, continuous rhythm in the pre-dawn light. The lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the crow of a rooster, all of these sounds would have been part of the morning symphony, a soundscape that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of the work that lay ahead. It's a soundscape that has largely disappeared from our modern world, a sound of a world that was in perfect sync with the rhythms of the sun. The dawn chorus has settled into a gentle hum, and now you're hearing the sounds of the forest in full spring. This is a soundscape of rebirth and vigorous new life. The primary sound is the continuous chirping and twittering of countless small birds, a sound that is both chaotic and profoundly beautiful. But it's not just the birds. You'd hear the quiet thrumming of 1,000 insects taking flight, a low, continuous buzz that would fill the air with a kind of pulsing energy. The soft pat-pat-pat of a rabbit as it bounds through a meadow, a sound of new energy and new life. The forest is full of these small, delicate sounds, sounds that tell a story of a world waking up from its long slumber. A mainstream historical fact is that spring was a time of immense relief and hope for medieval people. The sounds of spring were a promise of a new harvest, a new source of food, and a new chance at life. You'd hear the low, continuous thud of a plow being pulled by an ox, a sound of hard work and preparation for the coming months. The happy shriek of a child as they spotted a new flower, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Historians still argue about whether the sounds of spring were seen as more hopeful than the sounds of the harvest. The harvest was a sound of a promise fulfilled, but the spring was a sound of a promise being made. A quirky tidbit is the sound of the melting snow. You'd hear the quiet drip-drip of water from a branch, a sound of a world slowly returning to life. The soft gurgle of a small stream that had been frozen solid, a sound of freedom and flow. These were sounds that were unique to this season, sounds that told a story about the world being unburdened from the weight of winter. The sounds of a spring forest were a constant, continuous symphony of life, a sound that would be a profound source of peace and comfort to anyone who was lucky enough to hear it. The vibrant sounds of spring have given way to something more serene and deliberate. You're hearing the quiet footsteps of a medieval pilgrimage. This is a soundscape defined by a low, continuous rhythm, the soft thud-thud of a group of people walking together. It's a sound that is both personal and collective, a blend of individual steps that creates a single, unified pulse. You might hear the gentle swishy shush of their wool cloaks as they move, a sound that in the stillness of the forest would be a kind of continuous whisper. These sounds are not of a panicked flight or a chaotic battle. They are sounds of purpose and devotion, a journey measured in quiet footsteps. A mainstream historical fact is that pilgrimage was a central part of medieval life, and pilgrims often traveled in groups for safety. The sounds they made were a kind of acoustic shield, a continuous presence that would deter wild animals and bandits. You'd hear the low murmur of conversation, quiet prayers, and perhaps a soft, off-key hymn. These sounds were a kind of portable community, a soundscape that they carried with them as they traveled through the wilderness. Historians still argue whether the sounds of a pilgrimage were more or less peaceful than the sounds of daily life. The sounds of daily life were full of labor and stress, while the sounds of a pilgrimage were full of hope and devotion. A quirky tidbit is the sound of the pilgrims' staffs. The quiet tap-tap of a wooden staff on the ground was a constant, rhythmic sound, a kind of walking metronome that would have been a profoundly comforting presence. The sound of a staff on a rock was a different sound entirely, a sharp clack that would have served as a warning to be careful. These sounds were a kind of communication, a way of telling the person behind you what kind of terrain you were on. It was a soundscape of slow, deliberate progress, a world that was moving at a human pace. And as you imagine it, just picture that long, continuous line of people, their quiet footfalls and low murmurs, a gentle, continuous presence in the vastness of the forest. It's a sound that promises peace and purpose, a sound that would lull you to sleep with a profound sense of calm. The quiet of the pilgrimage has given way to something more deliberate and powerful. You're hearing the sound of a truly ancient craft, the felling of an oak tree. This is a soundscape of immense slow-motion power. The primary sound is not the quick thud-thud of a woodsman's axe, but the slow, rhythmic swish-wish of a two-man saw, a long, continuous sound that would have required immense strength and teamwork. This sound would be a low, continuous rumble, a kind of acoustic groan as the saw chewed its way through the ancient wood. This is a sound that tells a story of patience, of deliberate action, of a time when the largest tasks were accomplished with immense human effort. A mainstream historical fact is that oak trees were a vital resource in the Middle Ages. They were used for everything from ships and buildings to furniture and barrels. The sound of an oak being felled was a sign of a major project, a sound of a future being built. Historians still argue about whether the felling of an ancient tree was seen as a violent act against nature or a necessary part of progress. It was likely both. The sound of the saw was a sound of human ingenuity, but the sound of the tree's final moment was a sound of a life ended. A quirky tidbit is the sound of the sawyer's call. You'd hear the quiet, rhythmic whoop as they pulled the saw back and forth, a kind of communication that kept them in sync. This was a sound that was unique to this profession, a kind of secret language of the woods. And then there's the sound of the tree's final moment, the slow, protesting creak, creak, creak as it begins to lean, a sound that would be a kind of final warning, followed by a sudden deafening crash as it hits the ground, a sound that would echo through the forest for miles. This was a sound of finality, of a life ended for a human purpose. After the crash, you'd be left with a sudden, jarring silence. A silence that was both a relief and a kind of mourning. The felling of an oak was a constant reminder of the human presence in the forest. A sound that was both a promise of warmth and a symbol of nature's subjugation. And now you're hearing something far more ethereal, the sounds of a medieval forest on a foggy morning. This is a soundscape of eerie, muffled stillness. The primary sound is the absence of sound, a kind of acoustic blanket that swallows up all but the most immediate noises. The chirping of birds is muted to a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. The rustle of a squirrel is a quiet swish instead of a sharp patter. It's a soundscape that feels both peaceful and deeply unsettling, a world that is holding its breath. A shout or a loud call would be swallowed up almost immediately, a sound that would feel both impotent and lonely. Your own footsteps, too, would be muted, a quiet thud that would tell you that you were a small, insignificant presence in a vast, silent world. A mainstream historical fact is that fog was a serious danger to travelers and hunters in the Middle Ages. The loss of visibility and the strange acoustics would have made it easy to get lost, and the sounds you heard would have been a constant source of confusion. Historians still argue about whether the sounds of a foggy morning were more or less mystical than the sounds of the night. The night, at least, was a known entity. The fog was a world of shifting, uncertain sounds. A world where a familiar sound could suddenly become a strange and alien one. And then there are the sounds that the fog creates that are unique to it. The soft, continuous drip-drip of water from the leaves. A sound that would be a constant, gentle presence. The quiet plop of a drop hitting a puddle. A sound that in the stillness would feel like a tiny, musical note. The low, mournful moan of a distant cow. A sound that would be both a comfort and a sign of a world that felt far away and unreachable. These were the sounds of a world that was in suspension, a world that was holding its breath. The fog has begun to lift, and now you're left with the quiet echoes of a world that once was. We've journeyed through a soundscape of immense variety, from the loud chaos of the hunt to the peaceful hum of a shepherd's flock. You've heard the sounds of Purpose the woodsman's axe, the forester's hatchet hand, the sounds of fear, the boar's grunt, the wolf's howl. You've heard the sounds of community and of solitude, of life and of death. These sounds were not just noises. They were the story of a world that was in constant, quiet conversation with itself. And now, as you lie here, the sounds of the medieval forest are fading. The crackle of the fire is becoming a low, gentle hiss. The distant murmur of voices is becoming a quiet, continuous hum. The sounds of the animals, the quiet rustle of their movements, are becoming a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. All of the sounds, from the mundane to the magical, are blending into a single, seamless whole, a kind of acoustic blanket that is covering the world in a profound, deep stillness. The sounds of the past are now just echoes, fading and disappearing into the quiet of the night. The forest has always been a place of secrets, and its sounds were the key to unlocking them. But now, in our modern world, we have lost that key. We have filled our lives with so much noise that we no longer know how to listen. We have lost the ability to hear the quiet sounds of the natural world, the gentle rhythms of life that once guided us, and in doing so, we have lost a part of ourselves. But tonight, for a moment, you were there. You stood in that forest, and you listened. You heard the sounds of a world that was both wild and beautiful. A world that was in perfect sync with the rhythms of the sun, the moon, and the stars. You heard the sounds of a world that was whole, a world that was at peace. And as those last echoes of a forgotten time fade, you can feel your own body growing heavy. The sounds around you, the gentle whir of the fan, the soft hum of the refrigerator, are no longer a distraction. They are becoming a part of the quiet, a part of the stillness. Your breathing is slowing, your thoughts are quieting, and you can feel your mind drifting, floating on a sea of peace. There is nothing left to do now but to let go. Let go of the day. Let go of your thoughts. Let go of everything. There is only the quiet, just the sound of the wind, just the sound of the leaves, just the sound of your own quiet breathing. Good night.